Welcome to the Woke as Fuck podcast. This is PSA Sitch. Okay, well, a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This will be a long-form commentary on Sam Harris's discussion with Ezra Klein. Since the original podcast is 2 hours long, I'll be cutting as much as I can. And unlike my other videos, since it is so long, this won't be animated. So feel free to listen while you exercise or play video games. And don't worry, I'm working on a more typical video at the moment as well. Excuse me. Anyways, this all started when Sam Harris had Charles Murray on his podcast. Murray is the author of The Bell Curve. In the book, he argues that society is becoming stratified by intelligence, and something has to be done about this, otherwise we're in for a bad time. However, he also claims that a part of IQ is genetic, and that if you group IQ by race, black people have a lower average IQ than white people.
Ergo, concordantly, vis-a-vis.
That would mean that some of the racial differences in IQ are genetic. So I'm sure you can all see where the controversy stems from. Many are quick to call Murray racist for suggesting this. This came to a head last year, when Murray was booked to speak at Middlebury College in Vermont. There, student protesters prevented him from speaking, and when he was being escorted out to a different location, some of the student protesters attacked him, and ended up giving a concussion to another professor at the school who was trying to protect Murray, a professor who was going to speak counter to Murray's position. This incident led Sam to have Murray on his podcast, which of course angered some of our more far left-leaning individuals, including Ezra Klein, editor and creator of the online publication Vox. Vox wrote a response to Sam and Murray's discussion, where they were, let's say, less than charitable to both of them. This led to Sam complaining about the article to Ezra, which led to a long email exchange and a debate challenge. A year passed without much happening until David Reich, a Harvard professor of genetics, published an op-ed for the New York Times saying that society can no longer deny genetic differences between human populations, including race. This led both Murray and Sam to take swipes at Vox and Ezra on Twitter. This in turn led to Ezra publishing his own lengthy article on Vox, criticizing Murray and Sam. This in turn led Sam into deciding to publish his email correspondence with Ezra, which I'm sure you can imagine didn't go over well with anyone. So this is after all this controversy, finally, we come to the actual discussion between Sam and Ezra. However, my critique on the conversation isn't going to be so much on what info there is on the genetics and IQ argument, rather, the way in which Sam and Ezra debate the topic. Because honestly, I was pretty baffled in the discussion at how dishonest Ezra was being in how he approached the conversation. However, it's in a somewhat subtle way, so it may not have been very apparent unless you're really paying close attention. And if you're looking at this and saying, wow, this video's an hour long, that's actually wrong! This video is over 2 hours long. I've made a second channel, PSA Sitch 2, where I will be uploading either more long-form content like this, or just articles and ideas I want to quickly comment on without a lot of production. So if you want some good old Sitch in your life in between uploads, go sub to PSA Sitch 2, link in the description. Now I'll be chopping the podcast up quite a bit. The link to the full podcast will be in the description below. And now, let us begin.
While I have very little interest in IQ and actually zero interest in racial differences in IQ, I invited Murray on my podcast because he had recently been deplatformed at Middlebury College, and he and his host were actually assaulted as they left the auditorium. And in my view, this seemed yet another instance of a kind of moral panic that we were seeing on college campuses. And it caused me to take an interest in Murray that I hadn't previously had. So I had never read The Bell Curve because I thought it must be just racist trash, because I assumed that where there was, all that smoke, there must be fire. And I hadn't paid attention to Murray. And so when I did read the book and did some more research on him, I came to think that he was probably the most unfairly maligned person in my lifetime. it doesn't really run the risk of being much of an exaggeration there. And the most controversial passages in the book struck me as utterly mainstream with respect to the science at this point. They were mainstream at the time he wrote them, and they're even more mainstream today. So I perceived a real problem here of free speech and a man's shunning. And I was very worried. I felt culpable because I had participated in that shunning somewhat. I had ignored him. As I said, I hadn't read his book. I had declined at least one occasion where I could have joined a project that he was associated with. And I declined because he was associated with it, because I perceived him to be radioactive. So I felt a moral obligation to have him on my podcast.
So we can already see that Sam's primary concern is the deplatforming, silencing, and maligning of people who dare to postulate ideas that are not PC. And it's even worse if those ideas are at least based off of data. Sam doesn't actually really care that much about the race IQ debate itself, although he does believe Murray is correct factually, and that they both believe that while there is a genetic component to IQ, it's not entirely genetic.
IQ is not one of my concerns, and racial differences in IQ is absolutely not one of my concerns. But a person having his reputation destroyed for honestly discussing data, that deeply concerns me. Let's just start with you. I mean, what don't I get? Why is your criticism of me and Murray valid? I mean, just give me your take on all of this.
All right. Well, I appreciate that summary. Obviously, and I'm sure we'll get into this stuff, I have disagreements with which articles are fair and which aren't, but I don't think that is where I want to begin this. I'm sure we'll go through that. So, something you've said over and over and over again to me at this point is that to you from the beginning, I've been here in bad faith. The problem is that I've come to this, coming to slander you, to destroy your reputation, to silence you. And I take that as a signal failure on my part. I have not been able to persuade you, and maybe I will be today, that I really disagree with you strongly. I think some of the things you're trafficking in are not just wrong, but they're harmful. But I do so in good faith, and I'm here because I want to persuade you.
Now it's important that everyone remember this. Ezra's first point is that Sam is too quick to believe people are acting in bad faith against him. Ezra will bring this up multiple times in the podcast. Now, I agree that Sam, at least recently, has been quick to do this, but this bad faith point will become very important to the overall theme of the discussion.
And I think you gesture at this in your opening here. You begin that conversation by really framing it around your shared experience responding to politically correct criticism. You say, and I'm quoting you here, in the intervening years, so the intervening years since Murray published The Bell Curve, that I ventured into my own controversial areas as a speaker and writer. I experienced many hysterical attacks against me in my work. I started thinking about your case being Murray's case, a little, again, without ever having read you, and I began to suspect that you were one of the canaries in the coal mine that I never recognized as such. So you say explicitly in the opening to that podcast that in the treatment of Murray, you saw the seeds of later treatment of you.
So this is actually a good start for Ezra. He has reaffirmed and repeated Sam's primary concern. Well, sort of. He actually gets it partially wrong, and as we're about to see, is already planting the seeds to hypocritically view Sam's position in bad faith.
And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because something that I've been trying to do here is see this from your perspective. Here is my view. I think you clearly have a deep empathy for Charles Murray's side of this conversation because you see yourself in it. I don't think you have as deep an empathy for the other side of this conversation, for the people being told, once again, that they are genetically and environmentally and at any rate immutably less intelligent, and that our social policy should reflect that. And I think part of the absence of that empathy is it doesn't threaten you. I don't think you see a threat to you in that in the way you see a threat to you in what's happened to Murray.
Already we see a couple things. One, empathy has nothing to do with discerning what is a fact. Remember, Sam asked Ezra, what do I and Murray have wrong? He means in relation to the data. Sam wants facts. And yet, Ezra's opening salvo doesn't address the facts at all. In fact, he doesn't even talk about the facts until over an hour into the podcast. It really shows where Ezra's primary concern is. Not with facts, but with a more typical far-left feelings approach. Secondly, we can see Ezra is already blinded by identity politics. He automatically assumes that the reason Sam cares about Murray is a selfish one, that Sam empathizes with Murray being a white guy that SJW types don't like. And while I'm sure that's true to a degree, it completely invalidates Sam's spoken reasons for the importance of being able to discuss science, facts, and data openly. So Ezra is already being a hypocrite because he is acting in bad faith, assuming he knows the real reason Sam cares about this, and not the reason Sam gives.
I like your podcast. I think you have a big platform and a big audience, and I think it's bad for the world if Murray's take on this gets recast here as political bravery or impartial or non-controversial.
Now, for any of you that have been involved in the community, you probably immediately heard that what Ezra said is one of the most standard SJW positions. You have a big platform, and it's bad if someone I believe is bigoted is cast in a positive light on your platform.
What I want to convince you of is that there's a side of this you should become more curious about. You should be doing shows with people like Ibram Kendi, who's the author of Stamped from the Beginning, which is a book on racist ideas in America, which won the National Book Award a couple years back. People who really study how race and these ideas interact with American life and policy.
Again, the standard SJW complaint, you're not talking about the issues that I believe are important. And mind you, Ezra has yet to even acknowledge or empathize in the slightest with Sam's position.
I think the fact that we are two white guys talking about how growing up non-white in America affects your life and cognitive development is a problem here, just as it was a problem in the Murray conversation.
Notice how Ezra has already dishonestly framed the conversation as if Sam agrees with him. If Sam's point is that some part of IQ is genetic, then how someone grows up in America is mostly irrelevant. Yet Ezra is framing it like how someone grows up in America is the sole factor influencing IQ, and that Sam already agrees with him on this.
And I want to persuade you that some of the things that the so-called social justice warriors are worried about are worth worrying about, and that the excesses of activists, while very real and problematic, they're not as big a deal as the things they're really trying to fight and to draw attention to.
I hate to keep saying it, but again, this is one of the most standard SJW positions out there. And that's whenever they say, yeah, there are some things that SJWs do that are bad, but oh boy, those racists are far worse. As if it's some kind of zero-sum game. Classic tribalistic hand-waving away of the bad things people on your team do as not being widespread or a big deal. And how foolish it all is. This whole anti-SJW movement wouldn't exist if people on the far left would just denounce this SJW behavior of shutting down speech and attacking people. People like Ezra are ignorant that whenever someone hand waves away SJW behavior, it only makes us more resolved in our position. And he's doing a terrible job trying to persuade Sam. One of the major disagreements we have with the far left is on assigning what is important. Sam believes that freedom of speech and figuring out what is objective reality is more important, while Ezra believes that eliminating ideas people may use for racist reasons is more important. This is one of the main points of disagreement. For Ezra to just tell Sam, well, you're wrong to concentrate on the things you concentrate, is completely pointless.
The first is that I was, as you said, very quick to attribute malice and bad faith to you in the email exchange. And it's quite possible I did this when it wasn't warranted.
So Sam is directly addressing one of Ezra's points and is apologizing. sort of, but he's at least trying to make a ground. Now Sam goes on a sort of lengthy explanation about why he's quick to assume bad faith, because he's constantly being attacked by people on the far left that deliberately take a statement out of context, and you will notice that not once in this entire conversation does Ezra ever acknowledges Sam's positions or feelings here. Ezra never attempts to make any ground or empathize with Sam on this point or any point. All he does is continually tell Sam that he's wrong.
So my fuse is pretty short. I am the first to admit that. And if I treated you unfairly, attributing bad faith when you were just led by sincere conviction that I had made an error, or that you were arguing for something that was so important and that I wasn't seeing it, that is on me. Now, that said, I think your argument is where it pretends to be factual, wherever you think it is factual, it is highly biased by political considerations. And these are political considerations that I share. The fact that you think I don't have empathy for people who suffer just the starkest inequalities of wealth and politics and luck, it's telling and it's untrue. I think it's even untrue of Murray. And the fact that you're conflating the social policies he endorses, like the fact that he's against affirmative action and he's for universal basic income, and I know you don't happen to agree with those policies, you think that would be disastrous. There's a good faith argument to be had on both sides of that conversation. That conversation is quite distinct from the science, and even that conversation about social policy can be had without any allegation that a person is racist or that a person lacks empathy for people who are at the bottom of society. So that's one distinction I want to make. And the other thing that I regret, which I think this is the thing you're taking me to task for, and I understand it, but I do regret that in the preface to my podcast with Murray, I didn't add some full discussion of racism in America. I think it should be obvious, with a modicum of charity extended to us, that Murray and I are not racist, and that what we were saying was not coming from a place of racial animus.
And something I want to be clear about is what I think was wrong in that podcast is not that you didn't virtue signal. It's not that you didn't come out and say, hey, listen, just before I start this up, I want everybody to know I'm not a racist. And by the way, I'm not here to say you're a racist. I don't think you are. We have not called you one. I actually think that's a different set of things, and we should talk later. I think this would actually be a good conversation for us to have.
In the original article, they call both Sam and Murray racialist, which is just a nice way of saying racist. Plus, the whole thing is implied that they are racist, so I think this is a pretty dishonest dodge from Ezra, who we will continually see throughout this whole conversation does actually believe that Murray is a secret racist.
But my criticism of your podcast, and by the way, my criticism also of Murray, and this is useful because I can work backwards through your answer here, is not that you didn't excuse yourself. It's that in a conversation about an outcome of American life, right? How do African Americans and whites score on IQ tests in America today? You did not discuss actually how race and racism act upon that outcome. You did not discuss, amazingly to me, you all didn't talk about slavery or segregation once.
So Ezra's complaint is that Sam and Murray looked at the data about genes that doesn't have much to do with any of what Ezra is talking about. Also, Ezra's again mad that Sam and Murray just don't believe the same thing Ezra believes. This is a dangerous way to think, as I have found that a large amount of arguments, not even political, but just personal arguments in your life, center around the parties involved assuming the other person is seeing reality and prioritizing things the same way you are. That's part of why people get so angry in arguments and are so quick to assume bad faith or bigotry, because from their outlook, the other person could only disagree with them if they are bigoted in some way, rather than understanding the person simply has a different outlook and priority.
As it comes to the way you actually conducted the conversation, I'm arguing that you lacked a sense of history, that you didn't deal in a serious way with the history of this conversation, a conversation that has been going on literally since the dawn of the country, a conversation that has been wrong in virtually every version, in every iteration we've had in America before.
Translation: How dare you believe something that I don't? Now allow me to give you zero evidence on why you're wrong.
You're a neuroscientist, and so I get that you look at Murray and you look at the bell curve, and what you see are the tables and the appendices and the kind of scientific version of Charles Murray.
Okay, so directly after complaining that Sam and Murray didn't look at the history, he acknowledges that Sam doesn't care about the history and is looking at the science. So Ezra understands Sam's position. He just thinks it's wrong, but will give no reasons or evidence why it's wrong. Just criticize him. Okay?
I'm a policy journalist. My background is I live in Washington, D.C., I cover politics. Charles Murray, not just to me, what he literally is what we call a policy entrepreneur. He's somebody who his entire career has been spent at Washington think tanks. He's at the American Enterprise Institute, where I have a lot of friends, and I respect that organization quite a bit. And he argues in different ways and throughout his entire body of work for policy outcomes. His book before The Bell Curve is called Losing Ground. It's a book about why we should dissolve the Great Society programs. By the way, when he was selling that book, he said, a lot of whites think they're racist, and this is a book that tells them they aren't.
Do you like how Ezra presented that statement with no explanation? Like as if somehow that statement is so horrible that we all just know it's racist. It really shows that Ezra is trapped in a far-left bubble. Not to mention, dog whistle.
Then he came out with the bell curve, and we'll go through this, and I'll quote this back to you, but the bell curve's final chapter, he says, why did I do any of this? Why did I talk about any of this? Him and Richard Herrnstein, obviously the co-author of that book, do. And he says, the reason I did it is because we in America need to re-embrace a politics of difference. We need to understand that we are cognitively different from each other, not just by race, but other folks too, but by race as well. And that understanding that changes what we should do in social policy. He literally says, and again, I can quote this to you if you'd like, he says, for one thing, we have all these low cognitive capacity women giving birth. And by having these social supports for poor children in this country, we are subsidizing them to give birth. And what we need to do is take those subsidies away. So these women who, according to his book, are disproportionately African American, their poor children do not get as much federal support when they are born. And so they are disincentivized to have as many children. He also says that we have all these folks who are Hispanic coming up over the border, that our immigration policy is letting in too many low IQ people. And while he's not quite as prescriptive in that part, he's pretty clear that he wants us to change our immigration policy.
Ezra lays this all out again, presuming we all see the same version of reality. Should the country be subsidizing lower IQ people to have more children and to immigrate to this country? From a purely unemotional, pragmatic view, no. However, we can begin to see the roots of Ezra's thinking, as his thought process goes. Murray wants to stop incentivizing low IQ people from breeding and receiving government assistance and coming into the country. Murray is claiming that black people on average have lower IQ scores, thus black people would disproportionately be affected by Murray's policies. Thus, Murray is actually racist, and his data is just an excuse for racism. So Ezra's entire position against Murray is that he's dog whistling. That Ezra is a mind reader and knows Murray's true intentions. This is so ironic because it shows how hypocritical Ezra is. For he started this conversation off by chastising Sam for being quick to assume his critics are acting in bad faith. Yet Ezra's entire position against Murray is that Murray is a bad faith actor operating through secret dog whistles, for his true intentions are to enact policies in order to hurt black people. Even though there are far more low IQ white people and far more low income white people in the country, so way more white people would be hurt by any sort of policy like that.
The other thing, you brought up his UBI work. And this is why, the reason I bring this up is that the reason I think Charles Murray's work is problematic is that he uses these arguments about IQ and a lot of other arguments he makes about other things to push these points into the public debate, where he is very, very, very influential. He's not by any means a silenced actor in Washington. His book on UBI but it is a way of cutting social spending, according to Murray's own numbers. He says it would cut social spending by $1 trillion in 2020.
I like how Ezra just assumes that any ideas to cut social spending equates to bad or racist. Now listen to this next part very closely. Ezra starts off by saying what he believes is Murray's secret racist intentions, but then has to back off in the same sentence and revise it, otherwise he'd be accused of being a liar.
So this is another book in a different way that is a huge argument for cutting social spending, which in part he justifies by saying, we are trying to redress racial inequality based on an idea that is a product of American history, when in fact it is some combination of innate and environmental, but at any rate, it is not something we're going to be able to change. And so we should stop trying, or at least stop trying in the way we have been.
Did you catch that? Right at the end, he claims Murray said, "We can't change race inequality, so we should stop trying. ... I mean, at least stop trying in the way that we have been." Wow. It's not like those are two entirely different concepts. Now, at first I thought maybe it was some slip-up on my part, because Ezra says...
He justifies by saying...
So does that mean this is a quote? Well, you can find a PDF of Murray's book on UBI, In Our Hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State, pretty easily, and there is no quote like that in the book. In fact, the only people who come up on Google related to redressing racial inequality and Murray are people criticizing him. So I guess when Ezra says...
He justifies by saying...
He means he's mind-reading Murray's intentions here as secret racism.
Okay, Ezra, again, you can't conflate his views on social policy with an honest discussion of empirical science. Those are two separate conversations. You can agree about the data or disagree in a good faith way about the data and have a separate conversation about what to do in response to the data and then disagree in a good faith way about that.
This is a key difference in thinking as Sam is looking at it scientifically, and science doesn't care about policy. Sam wants to know what is true. We saw in his first Jordan Peterson debate that Sam places a very high importance in the concept that there is some objective truth that all humans can agree upon. Now, I personally completely agree with this point of view. However, this way of thinking is highly problematic to the far left, because the whole idea of intersectionality is that these ideas cannot be taken apart and looked at individually. Plus, Ezra literally cannot do what Sam is asking, as Ezra's entire position of Murray being a secret racist relies on interpreting Murray's policies and not on what he's actually said or wrote. If he were to isolate the data from the policies, he would have no argument.
Now, I'm not defending Murray's view of what the social policy should be. I'm open-minded about universal basic income. I think there can be a good faith debate about many of these topics. It's a completely separate conversation. And I totally share your concern about racism and inequality. And again, I have no interest in using science to establish differences between races. But the problem is that the data on population differences will continue to emerge whether we're looking for it or not. And the idea that one should lie about these data or pretend to be convinced by bad arguments that are politically correct, or worse, that it's okay to malign people or even destroy their reputations if they won't pretend to be convinced by bad arguments, that's a disaster. Morally and politically and intellectually, that is a disaster. And that's where we are, right? That's my criticism of what you have done at Vox and what Turkheimer and Nisbet and Hardin have done.
Do you think Ezra will address this point? Spoiler alert, no. In fact, Ezra doesn't really address much of the substance of any of Sam's points. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, I find it's better to simplify your argument into one simple sentence that you can directly ask the person to respond to. Counterintuitively, when you give these long responses, you give the person you're speaking to a lot of room on what they want to respond to. You are essentially giving up control of the direction of the conversation.
You know, you just claimed you didn't call us racist, right? You didn't use the word racist. I'll grant you that. You used the word racialist, right? Which you know most people will read as racist. But even if that is an adequate way to split the difference, everything else you said imputed, if not an utter racial bias and a commitment to some kind of white superiority. You say again and again that, I mean, here's a quote from your article. This is actually the subtitle of the article. And when I called the podcast with Murray Forbidden Knowledge, you said it isn't forbidden knowledge. It's America's most ancient justification for bigotry and racial inequality, right? We're shilling for bigotry and racial inequality. And then you convict Murray, again, this is a quote, of being engaged in a decades-long focus on the intellectual inferiority of African Americans. Now, honestly, that is a smear. I mean, Murray has not been focused on African Americans. He's been waging a decades-long battle to survive being scapegoated by people who insinuate that he's a racist. And the nature of that battle is to continually you have to keep touching this issue to get the slime off of you. But as you know, the bell curve was not focused on race. There's just one chapter on race.
Sam has made a mistake, and that not only is he giving Ezra a lot of room to respond to this claim of mind reading, but also because Ezra has read a lot more of Murray's books, so he can just keep quoting things Sam can't confirm or deny. Try not to position yourself to have to defend other people's motivations, as typically only one person knows the real answer to that. But more importantly, this just further gives Ezra room to not acknowledge Sam's main point about the dangers of denying data and placing PC concerns over figuring out what is true.
I want to read a quote from Murray on my podcast because this is, again, I'm not at all arguing for his social policies. I just want us to be fair to the man. And so this is a quote. If there's one thing that writing the bell curve did, it sensitized me to the extent to which high IQ is pure luck. Okay, none of us earn our IQ, whether it's by nature or nurture. We aren't the ones who did the nurturing. Hard work and perseverance and all those other qualities are great, but we can't take credit for our IQ. We live in a society that is tailor-made for people with high IQs. The people who got the short end of the stick in that lottery deserve our admiration and our support if they're doing everything right. And so that's the end of the quote.
So now we have a direct quote that completely goes against Ezra's entire mind-reading, secret dog-whistling narrative that he has about Murray.
He is worried about a world where success is determined by a narrow range of abilities. And these abilities, whether they come from nature or nurture, are distributed unequally. That's guaranteed to be true. We just know that they can't possibly be equal, both among individuals and across groups, and when you're talking about the averages in groups.
So Sam's perspective of Murray is the exact opposite of Ezra's. Ezra believes Murray wants to stifle the growth of low IQ people in the US and frames that as hurting them. Sam's perspective is that Murray wants to help low IQ people have a place in society. He frames this as a positive thing. Interestingly, both positions can be true at the same time, as they are not directly contradictory. Only the view that some things are good or bad is the contradiction.
So to paint him as callous and as racist, and as essentially a white supremacist, you're talking, he's fixated on the inferiority of blacks on your account. It is irresponsible and unethical, and that's the kind of wrong that I was trying to address by giving him a platform on my podcast, and that is what produced so much outrage in me in our email exchange.
When I hear this, I actually really wonder how much. I want to be careful here. I know Charles Murray.
Now listen closely, as you are about to hear a person give a justification for having mind-reading superpowers.
When I wrote my very first piece as a journalist in Washington, it was a piece about poverty. I interviewed him for it. I've reviewed his books. I've talked with him. My wife is writing a book about UBI, actually. He's quoted in the book. I do not want Charles Murray silenced, and he's a lovely guy interpersonally. There's no doubt about that. And the quote you read from him about luck, I want to put a pin in that because there's a whole conversation I want to have with you about that quote. If Charles Murray followed what that quote implies, I think things would look very different with him and with my view of his career. But I do think I need to go through some of what you said here. So first, I don't know how much you understand Charles Murray's career. As I said, his first book is Losing Ground. It's a book about the Great Society.
In the
It's a
interest of
book that he
time and basic human sanity here, Ezra,
No,
I'm
I
worried that what you're going to do is all the stuff you're going to cover is actually irrelevant because one.
Hey, Sam, I've let you had your say. I'm just gonna keep going.
Okay, that's fine, but I just want to prevent your and listener frustration here because if you go on for 10 minutes for me to only say, well, again, his social policies are not social policies I'm advocating.
Unfortunately, this is Sam's fault, since he is arguing that Murray isn't a secret racist and not directly calling out Ezra for mind reading. This allows Ezra to just go back and spend all this time on more of his Murray is a secret racist dog whistling claims, which again distracts from Sam's primary concern.
So his first book is Losing Ground. It's about dissolving the welfare state. And again, he says about that book, a lot of whites think they're racist. I'm going to show them they're not. Next book is A Bell Curve.
Again, Ezra just says this statement like it means something on its own.
The way Murray often defends The Bell Curve is by saying, hey, look, it only had this one chapter on race and IQ. And he's completely, or actually a couple chapters, but he's completely right about that. The chapters where that is mentioned, they are not the bulk of the book. But I'm actually a publisher of pieces. And I work with a lot of authors on book excerpts. The furor around the bell curve is not around the book, which it's a long book. Most people haven't read it. It's that the part of the book that he had excerpted on the New Republic, on the cover of the New Republic under Andrew Sullivan, the cover of the New Republic, it just says in big letters, race and IQ. The reason that is the part people focus on is that they pulled the most controversial part of the book and made it a huge deal. I know that authors, when they don't want their most controversial part to define the work, they don't let you excerpt that. So one, I don't think Murray's blameless here.
Ezra isn't arguing some specific thing Murray said, but is focusing on what is being implied, which is not only faulty, but Ezra negates his own argument because he gives a logical reason for why the excerpt on this one magazine would be chosen. Because it's controversial and clickbait, and that's what gets buzz about your book. If Ezra's a publisher, as he said, he should know that.
His next book is honestly weirder. I don't know if you've ever read or even are that familiar with Human Achievement.
I mean, just to be on the record here, I've read The Bell Curve and I've read Coming Apart, and that's all. And
Coming Apart's an interesting book too.
And Coming Apart just spells out his concern about the cognitive stratification of society.
So Human Achievement is a book where Murray, and comes right after The Bell Curve. And when I describe this book, I almost feel like people are not going to believe me, but go look it up. Murray wants to quantify the human achievements of different races. And the way he does that is he looks in a bunch of encyclopedias and he literally counts up the amount of space given to the accomplishments of artists and philosophers and scientists from different places. And he uses that to say Europeans, white Europeans, have done the most to push forward human achievement. One criticism that I and other people have of Murray is that he often looks at indicators that reflect inequality and uses them to justify inequality. That book is like one of the most massive correlation causation errors I can possibly imagine.
Now Ezra can start bringing up all these examples of things Sam doesn't know about, and cannot confirm or deny because he doesn't have the information. And considering Ezra's position is already, I'm mind-reading Murray, can we really trust that he's giving an objective description? He's already shown that he couldn't before. At this point in the conversation, I think Sam's best route would be to simply and honestly say, I'm not Murray, and I can only talk about the things I've seen from him. You are not addressing the direct things I've read from his work, but pointing to other works to invalidate it, and I have no way of confirming any of this. So for productivity's sake, I believe it would be best to instead focus on my primary concern of objective truth and free speech.
The final thing that you did in your answer to me here was you said again and again, people pretending to believe politically correct ideas, people pretending to believe bad evidence. A couple things on that. I don't doubt your sincerity in this. But I can assure you that Nisbet and Paige Harden and Eric Turkheimer and me, we actually believe what we believe. And one of the things that has honestly been frustrating to me in dealing with you is you have a kind of a very sensitive ear to where you feel that somebody has insulted you, but not a sensitive ear to yourself. During this discussion, you have called me, and not through implication, not through something where you're reading in between the lines, you've called me a slanderer, a liar, intellectually dishonest, a bad faith actor, cynically motivated by profit, defamatory, libelous. You've called Turkheimer and Nisbet and Paige Harding. You've called them fringe. You've said just here that they're part of a politically correct moral panic. I do think that you need to do a little bit more here to credit the idea that there just is a disagreement here.
I would like to point out the overwhelming irony here, as Ezra accuses Sam of not taking people's positions in good faith, which first of all Sam has already apologized for, but it's ironic because this is Ezra's entire position towards Murray. So far he hasn't argued a single factual complaint against Murray, rather he's arguing that Murray is just hiding his racism or nefarious intentions.
I get that you hate his social policies. I get that you see that he thinks his social policies are justified by what he thinks is empirically true in the world of data and facts and human difference. So there's a connection there, right? And you're worried that if one takes the data seriously in the way that he takes it seriously, if one endorses his interpretation of the data from psychology or psychometrics or behavioral genetics, that will lead to social policies that you find abhorrent or that you think will produce a massive amount of inequality or suffering or something wrong. And I get that. But the conflation is that talking about data is one thing. Talking about what should be done in light of the facts that you acknowledge to be true or are likely to be true is another.
So this is another key point of Sam's that Ezra will never directly address. You have to be super specific and direct in these conversations to get the other person to answer.
Everything you've said about the politics and the historical wrongs of racism, which you wrote about a lot in your last piece, I totally agree with, okay? And I'm probably more aligned with you politically than I am with Murray, which is to say that I share your biases. I share the bias that is leading you to frame the matter the way you're framing it. And your concerns here are totally understandable. I get all of that. So this goes to the charge of bad faith against you, which in this conversation, I admitted might have been unfair, right? You might not be the Glenn Greenwald character I read you to be at a certain point in that email exchange. But your bias here, your connection to the political outcomes when you're talking about the empirical science is causing you to make journalistic errors. It's causing Nisbet and Turkheimer to make errors of scientific reasoning. And these are obvious errors.
Now, while I agree that Ezra is doing these things, this is a terrible discussion tactic that Sam does a lot, as all it will do is make Ezra defensive.
I mean, in your last piece, you have this whole section on the Flynn effect and how the Flynn effect should be read as accounting for the black-white differences in purely environmental terms. Well, even Flynn rejects that interpretation of the Flynn effect. I mean, he had originally he publicly hoped that his effect would account for that, but now he has acknowledged that the data don't suggest that. And there are many other errors of this kind that you and Nisbet and Turkheimer are making when you criticize me and Murray.
Bringing up another lesser important point for Ezra to go after.
What you have in me is someone who shares most of your political concerns and yet is unwilling to, again, a loaded word, lie about what is and is not a good reading of empirical data and what is and is not a good argument about genetics and environment and and what is reasonable to presume based on what we already know. And again, the problem is that even if we never look for these things again, even if we follow this taboo and decide that there's no ethical reason to ever look at population differences, we will be continually ambushed by these data. They're just going to spring out of our study of intelligence generically or human genetics generically. It's happened on other topics already, and people try to keep quiet about it because, again, the environment journalistically and politically is so charged. And my criticism of you has been from day one that you are contributing to that political charge, and it's totally unnecessary.
One of the things I've come to think about you that I actually did not come into this believing is you're very quick to see a lot of psychological tendencies, cognitive fallacies, etc. in others that you don't see applying to yourself or people you've sort of written into your tribe.
So because Sam attacked Ezra's biases, now Ezra will attack Sam's biases. Again, distracting from the real issue and leading us down a path that will go nowhere. Though of course it's horribly ironic because Ezra is 100 times more guilty of what he's describing than Sam is.
Is it Charles Murray is a guy who works at conservative think tanks, whose first book was about why we should get rid of the welfare state, his whole life's work is about breaking down social policy. So to the extent that I have any biases that flow backwards from political commitments, so does he.
More mind reading. How do we know Murray doesn't promote policies he believes make sense with how he sees the data? The interesting thing is, by the implication Ezra made, it sounds like he's admitting that his own position is based on the policy outcome he wants, not on the data.
His whole life's work is about breaking down social policy. So to the extent that I have any biases that flow backwards from political commitments, so does he.
I do want to note, you mentioned James Flynn here. To prepare for this conversation, I called Flynn the other day. I spoke to him on Monday. His read of the evidence right now, and this is me quoting him, he says, "I think it is more probable than not that the IQ difference between Black and white Americans is environmental. As a social scientist, I cannot be sure if they have a genetic advantage or disadvantage." So that is what James Flynn thinks as of Monday.
So James Flynn, as of Monday, says, "I don't know." Riveting.
I think you have a huge sensitivity, let's put it that way. And you have a lot of difficulty extending an assumption of good faith to anyone who disagrees with you on an issue that you code as identity politics.
She can't take any more, Captain. The irony meter has reached critical mass.
To you, engaging in identity politics discredits your ability to participate in a rational conversation, and is something, as far as I can tell, that you do not see yourself as doing. So here's my question for you. On that specific quote, what does it mean to you, particularly when you're talking about something like race, to have your ideas contaminated by identity politics?
What I mean by identity politics is that you're reasoning on the basis of skin color or religion or gender or some particular trait which you have by accident. You fell into that bin through no process of reasoning on your own. You convinced to be white or black. And to reason from that place as though because you're you, because you have the skin color you have, certain things are true and very likely incommunicable to other people who don't share your identity. So, I view this as the most unhappy game of Dungeons and Dragons ever. People have these various stories of victimology that if you do the arithmetic one way, one group trumps another way, it gets reversed. And this strikes me as a moral and political and intellectual dead end.
Now I agree with what Sam said. However, I think an easier way to conceptualize it to someone like Ezra, why identity politics is bad, is because it's just tribalism. And tribalism means you get to be a hypocrite. You get to apply the rules to your tribe one way, and the rules to your enemy's tribe another way. And if you're not consistent in your beliefs or your rules, that means that everything you believe or act upon is a lie. That your principles are a lie, and you are simply just doing whatever you want and rationalizing it after the fact. And that ties directly into Sam's belief of the importance of objective reality.
Because the things that are really true, the things that will really move the dial with respect to human well-being. So my concern is, how can the future be better than the past? How can we get to a world where we cancel the worst effects of bad luck? Given that some people are hugely lucky and some people aren't, how can we cancel this with respect to wealth and health and everything else? And how can we get to a world where the maximum number of people thrive? I view identity politics as among the worst pieces of software you can be running to try to get there. I want to get to a world where, it's Martin Luther King's claim about the content of your character rather than the color of your skin, right? That is the goal. And if you want to reverse engineer that goal, giving primacy to identity is one of the worst things you can do. That's how I would frame it.
So that's super helpful for me. Here's my criticism of you now. I don't think you realize that the identity politics software is operating in you all of the time.
This really shows how trapped in his own bubble Ezra is. Obviously, every person is affected by bias, and by biases related to their identity. But Sam's point was centered on why that's a bad thing. And Ezra's response to that is, oh yeah? Well, you're biased too. No shit, Sherlock. But Sam is making a conscious effort to look past his bias. Ezra is not only not making any effort to do this, he's doing the exact opposite. He's praising identity bias. Also notice how Sam will consistently directly respond to Ezra's points and questions in good faith, and Ezra almost never directly responds to anything Sam says.
Is that whenever something gets near the question of political correctness, the canary in the coal mine for the way you yourself have been treated, you get very, very, very strident. They're in bad faith. They're not being able to speak rationally. They're not being able to have a conversation that is actually going forward on a sound evidentiary basis. And the thing that I don't think that you're self-reflective enough about, and I apologize because I know that I statements are better than you statements, but I do want to push this idea at you for you to think about it, is that there are things that are threats to you.
What is the point of this? Ezra's amateur psychoanalysis. If this is in good faith, Ezra Klein may be one of the most socially inept people on the planet. Can someone actually think for 1 second that this is going to persuade someone to be more self-reflective? Or is Ezra just trying to score points for his side? Is it bad faith?
I gotta have faith.
There are things that are threats to your tribe, to your future, to your career. And those threats are very salient. So you see what happened to Charles Murray, the kind of criticism he gets, and that sets off every alarm bell in your head. And you bring him on the show and you're like, we're going to fix this. I'm going to show that they can't do this to you.
Ezra is so absorbed in identity politics that he believes Sam's concern towards SJWs is entirely a personal and selfish one, and not on what Sam has repeatedly said outright several times. The importance of being able to look at and discuss what is and what is not an objective fact. The importance of being able to agree upon objective reality. We can argue on what to do about reality, but we can't ever make progress if we can't agree on what reality actually is. So now Ezra is mind-reading Sam and hypocritically assuming Sam is acting out of bad faith and not for the reasons he actually said.
And you look around and you say, Ezra, you think we shouldn't take away all efforts to redress racial inequality?
You hear how Ezra frames his own position?
And you look around and you say, Ezra, you think we shouldn't take away all efforts to redress racial inequality?
This is the third time he's used this framing tactic dishonestly. Is Ezra just a dishonest person, or just so self-absorbed that he's blind to it? Who knows? Unlike Ezra, I'm not a mind reader.
And you look around and you say, Ezra, you think we shouldn't take away all efforts to redress racial inequality? But that's a bias. You're just being led around by your political opinions, where I am standing outside the debate, acting rationally. And to me, that's actually not what's happening at all. I think that you're not here. I think you're missing a lot, because you are very radically increasing the salience of things that threaten your identity, your tribe, which is not the craziest thing to do in the world. It's not a terrible thing to do. We all do it. Without admitting, or maybe even without realizing, that's what you're doing.
Projection levels at maximum, Captain.
I think that there is a lot of discussion like this in the public sphere just generally at the moment. There are a lot of white commentators, of which I am also one, who look at what's happening on some campuses or look at what happens on Twitter mobs or whatever, and they see a threat to them. And the concern about political correctness goes way, 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 way up. And then the ability to hear what the folks who are making the arguments actually say dissolves. The ability to hear what the so-called social justice warriors are actually worried about dissolves. And I think that's a really big blind spot here. I think it's making it hard for you to see when people have good faith disagreement with you. And I also think it's making it harder for you to see how to wait some of the different concerns that are operating in this conversation. You're so concerned about Murray and what has happened to him when
So now we get a good insight into Ezra's mind, as basically he's saying, it's just because there's all this reporting on SJW nonsense that people won't listen to the actual race problems we have in this country. And that's why Ezra feels justified in downplaying all the SJW nonsense. Well, let me explain to you, Ezra, how all this over-concern, as you put it, about PC stuff and SJWs is 100% entirely your fault. Personally, it's your fault and the people who think and act like you. It ties in directly to your entire thought process. Let me break it down for you. So some college kids somewhere protest some speaker they accuse of racism or sexism or whatever, and the protest either becomes violent or they physically prevent the speaker from talking, infringing on free speech. Now, you and others may not personally agree with this tactic, maybe you even think it's wrong. Yet you don't say anything. You don't denounce it. Why? Well, let me engage in a little mind reading of my own. The reason you don't is because you view everything through the tribal lens. You think, if I speak out or make a big deal about these kids doing this, that will just give ammunition to my ideological opponent. That's why my ideological opponents don't want to listen to my concerns, because they just keep seeing reports of these horrible SJW college kids, and it blinds them to the real racial concerns of the country. So I'm just not going to talk about it. I mean, it's not even a big deal anyways. It's an isolated incident. Now, Ezra, this thought process is what's created the current version of Sam Harris. It's what's created people like me. It's what's created liberals who are just horrified that the mainstream left can't consistently and easily just denounce this behavior. Denounce these attacks on free speech. Denounce these Twitter mobs trying to get people fired for saying a fucking joke. If the mainstream left would overwhelmingly come out and say, hey, stop that. This is not liberal behavior, then this situation wouldn't exist. People like me wouldn't exist. This entire situation, this entire viewpoint about the concern of political correctness and SJWs that you're chiding Sam for only exist because you are trying to hide reality, Ezra, and this perfectly matches up with your thinking on the race IQ question, because you want to do the exact same thing here. You want to hide the truth because you're afraid your ideological opponents will use it against you. Well, here's the wake-up call, Ezra. It didn't work with free speech, and it's not gonna work with this. The left has already ceded the free speech position to the right, which is baffling, and now you want to cede objective facts to the racists. Because that's what's going to happen. Racists will then be able to point at this and say, see, we have evidence, and they want to hide the facts from you. And then the racist will use that opening you've created for them to push actual junk science that more people will believe because you've allowed them to be right on this one issue. You already should know how this works, Ezra. That's the liberal position on why abstinence-only education is stupid. We all know what happens when you make something forbidden. It attracts people. By trying to hide sex from teenagers, you only made it more appealing. Didn't you see Dirty Dancing? And since they won't learn about it properly, there's a better chance they'll engage in the behavior in an unsafe way. By trying to keep them safe, you've done the opposite. You understand this when it comes to abstinence-only education, but suddenly, when the issue is one that makes you feel personally uncomfortable, all that reasoning goes out the window. Well, I'm here to tell you, wake the fuck up.
in your whole show, Sam, you've had 120 some episodes. And I could have miscounted this. I totally take that as a possibility here.
It's amazing you would think this is relevant, but yes, give me the numbers.
I think you've had 2 African Americans as guests.
He's literally incapable of not seeing the world through this identity-driven lens.
I think you need to explore the experience of race in America more and not just see that as identity politics, see that as information that is important to talking about some of the things you want to talk about, but also to hearing from some of the people who you've now written out of the conversation to hear.
The classic, SJW, you're worried about things I don't think you should be worried about. This is a horrible, horrible point. If Ezra was being honest, why doesn't he just ask Sam why the Murray treatment issue concerns him more than the SJW stuff? Because Sam has already given that answer. Not being allowed to discuss what is objective truth because it might offend someone is a super important issue to Sam, and Ezra can't really win a debate on that. And again, here Ezra is trying to deny Sam's feelings as invalid without addressing them even once. Also notice that Sam answered Ezra's question directly about identity politics, yet Ezra has not countered Sam's point on why it's wrong, just accused Sam of engaging in his own.
When you're reasoning among strangers, you have to converge on solutions to problems that work independent of who you happen to be. I mean, this is why, John Rawls's veil of ignorance thought experiment was so brilliant. To design a just society, a great heuristic is to think of the society you would want, not knowing who you're going to be in it. That's the perfect nullification of the logic of identity politics. And the reason why I'm defending Murray to the degree that I have been is not because I have this incredible sympathy with him because he's a white guy like me. I defend Muslim reformers who are not white and ex-Muslims who are not white. I've spent way more time defending Ayaan Hirsi Ali than Charles Murray, and she's the victim of the same kind of leftist stupidity, frankly. Her demonization has the exact same structure that Murray's does, and I have spent an enormous investment of time and money, frankly, defending Ayaan. So your charge is false with respect to my motivations.
Sam sort of gets off on the wrong point here, as Ezra was sort of saying that he was defending him because he was white, but also because he's anti-racist, and views that as something that directly affects him. This gives Ezra continual room to ignore the more important first point of what Sam was saying.
So during our email exchange, let me use this as an example. You wrote to me, again quoting here, if James Flynn is right, then the mean IQs of African-American children, who are second and third generation upper middle class, should have converged with those of the children of upper middle class whites, but as far as I understand, they haven't.
It's taken over an hour for Ezra to finally address something about the data.
I think that sentence right there, that is not having enough experience or having thought hard enough or dug into the literature. I mean, there are different ways of learning about the world, of course, but about people whose experience is different than yours. I mean, I'll give one example here that I actually said to you in these emails. African-American families making $100,000 a year tend to live in neighborhoods with the same income composition as white families making $30,000 a year. So to say that you have an African-American family that is middle class or upper middle class, and that their experiences now is so similar to that of whites that somehow the environmental atmosphere around them has equalized, I think that is something that is being missed, and that I'll just finish on this point. The way you leverage identity politics here is a way of not forcing yourself to see some of that.
So we're finally getting into real facts about the issue, though hilariously, it's not brought up in the context of debating the fact, but rather as Ezra's proof of Sam's white privilege.